At the end of December 1992, the most loved patriarch of the family, Nonno Vittorio, died at Harrington Memorial Hospital in Southbridge, just short of 99 years old. He passed quietly, but not before having one last meal. He had previously said that he wasn't afraid of dying, that he had led a full and fruitful life. Ironically enough, Louise, Janet's mom, said it was 6 years ago to that day that Nonna Adalgisa had died. Eerie. On the short list of really nice people in my mind, he's one. He was an active, energetic, gentle man who loved to engage in conversation, not just talk. Amidst all the changes that have occurred in my life, this man has always looked the same and acted the same. He was 78 when Jan and I got married, and I was beginning to think that he would always be around. There are too few people of his nature. Louise had asked me to do the eulogy. I'm not sure I was the most appropriate choice, but I did my best. I'd never been quite so involved in the activities surrounding a funeral ceremony before. Though I wasn't involved in any of the planning or coordinating, as part of the family support group, I was a full participant. I've come to a better understanding of the reasons for some of the activities surrounding the death of a close friend or a relative. Instead of allowing those closest to the deceased to dwell on the loss, the support group helps those affected, including themselves, to weather the most difficult times by encouraging interaction and some degree of distraction from the loss. The expressions of sympathy and concern seem to strengthen ties between people, at least temporarily. People do and say things which ordinarily they wouldn't consider for various reasons. At that time, I was bothered by the lack of affection when it came to my own parents and their relationship with their families. The atmosphere is much more hostile and estranged. Getting those families together for anything, including a funeral, was a difficult task at best. I'm not very comfortable with the thought of being the eldest in my own generation. Relations with my parents are superficially cordial, but there seems to be a great deal of resentment on the part of both my parents with some things about me. I do understand that much of what they are and how they feel is the result of what they've been through, going back to childhood. But that doesn't make it any easier to deal with. On December 19th, Jan and I went to the Hanover Mall to shop around a little. Our last stop was Walden Bookstore across the street from the mall. On the way out, Janet had a small accident. The entrance exit is set up with two doors separated by an open area, being energy efficient. The whole thing is really a glass enclosure. While Janet headed toward the exit, I watched as she walked toward one of the glass walls which surrounded the area. I felt certain she'd noticed the glass in front of her, but she didn't, and bam, right into the glass. She bounced back a little confused. She hadn't really hurt herself, but she did smack her nose and forehead. I'm not sure if anybody else noticed, but we both had to laugh, me most of all, watching it happen. I found out while we were in Southbridge that some of the in-laws used to call Janet the Moth because she preferred to stay in the house and read books rather than play outside. Even when she went to the Cape, she'd often find a quiet place to read rather than sunbathe or swim. Her grandmother, Nonno's wife, Adalgisa, scolded her by exclaiming, "What's the matter with you? You anti-soc?" The nickname anti-soc stuck. We took our first cruise in January 93, on the horizon out of Puerto Rico. I'm not going into particulars, but we've gone on about 40 since then. Cruising has been our preferred vacation choice since that point. We love packing once, not having to drive anywhere, once on board the ship, checking out each ship, finding favorite spots, always knowing there was something to do and various entertainment venues to enjoy, and obviously, no worries about finding a restaurant or making selections from a menu. Add to that we got to see so many different ports of call that we never would have visited otherwise, and that we even love sea days. and looking out at the water, the sky, and the land features as we entered and departed from various ports. For Paul Jr.'s 18th birthday in '93, we made up a little sign and taped it to the edge of the top of the stairway that led to the bedroom. When he came downstairs, we gave him a card with a $100 bill inside. He was thrilled. He took the day off from his work and spent most of it with Alicia. Janet was going to make a lasagna for him and Alicia, but Alicia wanted to treat him to dinner in a nice restaurant. They went to the Witten house in Norwell. The bill for the whole fete came to about $42, which at that time was a significant amount. The same month, Paul won second prize at the VICA, or VICA, Vocational Industrial Clubs of America, regional competition held in Bourne. He came home with a trophy and a silver medal. He came in second out of 27 in the electronics area. We were very proud. On April 29th, '93, I had oral surgery to remove 2 wisdom teeth. Before the procedure, Jan was an angel and helped to keep my spirits up with lots of love and affection, which I hardly think I deserved, since she takes the brunt of my moodiness. The surgery lasted about an hour and 15 minutes. My biggest concern was how the anesthetic would affect my arrhythmia. According to the doctors, there was no problem. They were more concerned with my small mouth. After sticking needles into my arm just above the left wrist and administering the knockout drug, before I could even think or worry about it, I was out, and the next thing I remember being in the recovery room. I had to stay there for something over an hour, during which time everyone told me how well everything went. One of the nurses went to tell Jan that everything was fine. I finally got wheeled into the last room where they continued to monitor my blood pressure and pulse, stick gauze in both sides of my mouth, and wrap my head in a cold pack. The doctors shot me full of Novocaine to get me through the worst of the pain, but it made it even more difficult to talk. But I was absolutely relieved and made every effort to communicate with Jan, both with words and physically with hugs and squeezes. I was still on a high from the meds, told her about the note that I had left by the computer with instructions on what to do if I didn't make it. In May, Paul started his first full-time week at his new job at Yankee Controller. He eventually became a very integral part of their operations and was very close to his boss and even his boss's family. Also in May, Janet started a travel agent course, which even ended up changing the course of our life in the not-too-distant future. She was a star student and really loved the school and what it promised for future employment. On June 4th, '93, Paul had his graduation ceremony. He won an award for being the top student in the electronics shop. This was a pleasant surprise. VocaTech had been great for him, finally allowing him to shine in areas that he was really interested in and had a real aptitude for. I remember talking with him one time when he was feeling down and saying that he was wondering why he was even a member of our family, since he didn't share our interest in academics and reading. I sat and we were talking about VocaTech, and I thought that that would be the best route for him. And because I know he had an interest in things mechanical and electronic. And I said that if you get into the electronics program, there'll be all kinds of opportunities to open up for you. And it turns out that that was a good suggestion, and on Paul's part, a good route to take. Both kids were out of high school now. The speed at which those years passed was a real shock. All those early years when they were so dependent upon us, we were the center of their lives, their whole world. We were the ultimate authorities. Happiness was measured by what happened at home. Suddenly, Jen was spending only a few days a month at home and Paul only a few minutes a day. A new phase of life had dawned. At this point, I have to repeat that my chronic depression was deeper than ever. As I reflect back, I think I should have been institutionalized, really, for I was in no mental state to make major decisions, and my moods and seeming aloofness alienated me from my own wonderful children. They were not mature enough to understand what was wrong with their father. A comical incident occurred on June 13th, 93. The Blue Angels were flying at South Weymouth Naval Air Station. We walked down the gravel road by the approach lights toward the end of the airstrip. Alicia and Paul were a little fearful of going any further, so they stopped with their brother Mark at a location about halfway between the fence and the end of the runway. Jan and I ventured a little closer. Actually, I was looking for a way to get to the actual legal viewing area. The legal area was about a couple of minute walk from where we were, but it was across an open area, and I didn't want to be seen by the authorities. We decided to plunk down on the grass where we were. Suddenly, the police sirens could be heard. At first, I thought they were connected with an air show, but Paul Jr. came running down, told us they were coming up and right toward us. They stopped to pick up one guy who was even closer than we were. The kids jumped into the brush. I told Jan just to follow me and start walking back toward the fence, which was far too distant to run for. The first people to get us were the sailors on bicycles. At first, they scolded us for entering the area and told us to go back the way we came. Then the uniformed sailors came and told us to stay right where we were. Paul, Alicia, and Mark were discovered and apparently verbally abused. Paul said the fellow who was screaming at them to stop when it appeared they were with us. In any event, a van came to get us, drove us all the way across the base to Route 18 entrance, took our names and addresses, and told us to leave and not come back. Poor Alicia was crying in the van for a little bit, but recovered her composure fairly quickly. Paul Jr. was not intimidated at all. I just mentioned not to say anything and just sit quietly. One of the sailors was a real SOB. The others were fairly understanding. After we left the gate, walking against the throngs of people and cars still streaming into the base, we headed down Route 18 toward Rockland. We walked about 2 miles to Papagino's, where Paul called Angela, Alicia's mother, to see if she would pick us up. We were still 4 or 5 miles from home. We continued to walk down Route 58. 15 to 20 minutes later, Angela showed up. She thought it was all very funny, and we thanked her for telling us about the terrific spot that they found yesterday. At one point, Jan managed to help me out of one of my moods. She just kept reassuring me how much she loved me and how she always would. She said she's learned to accept my moods and understands how they're not normally her fault. I explained that since she is the one who is closest to me, that I vented my feelings by acting in ways that I know hurt her. That didn't mean that I gained any satisfaction, but at least I can affect a change in someone other than myself. And that's certainly a weird way to feel, but I think that is not an uncommon thing among people who are subject to the same kinds of emotional bouts that I suffer. In June, Jan ran into Cynthia Bowman, who used to be controller at Curry College. Talking with her, Cynthia said she had a friend who owned a travel agency and she would not hesitate to recommend Janet to her when she finished her training. Cynthia called me that night and told me that a computer position at the architectural school where she worked at that time was available. Initially, I wasn't really interested since it seemed to involve window PCs. I sent a letter to Cynthia explaining how it felt. In the letter, I indicated that unless they were willing to consider a client-server Macintosh-based system, I wasn't really the person for them. But not too long after, I did get a call from the Boston Architectural Center president, George Terrian, that lasted about 15 minutes. I didn't bother sending in a resume to the school since Cynthia explained that they were looking for someone to oversee the conversion of their administrative computer operations. That usually means they want someone with a mini or a mainframe operating experience. After our discussion, we set up an interview. The idea of once again being brought in to build something was very attractive, but it wasn't academic, which meant that I'd have to work during the summer. August 27th, I had an in-person meeting with George Terrian and the other staff at the BAC. The discussions lasted about an hour, during which I made the point that I didn't want to be in charge of the mainframe. such as it was, and was assured by George that I wouldn't. Then he asked me to spend a little time with Cynthia, after which Mark, the young registrar, was to show me the computer system. After speaking with Cynthia for about 5 minutes, George came back all smiles and offered me the job of manager of information systems. I expressed my very real surprise, but I told him I'd have to sleep on it and talk it over with my wife Janet. What I like is the idea of being the architect of their new computerized effort. I have been preparing for at least 3 years to do this at Curry, but no funds and little likelihood of any forthcoming soon. This was an opportunity that was hard to pass up. I liked the people, and they seemed to like me. They said during the interview that the stress level is usually pretty low, except during registration. After talking it over with Janet, I called Mr. Terrian at BAC and told him I'd be delighted to join the team at the college. He sounded delighted and underscored the unanimity of the screening committee by reminding me that it only took 5 minutes for them to make a decision after I left the room. I said that I would like to start as soon as possible. On June 30th, we were sitting in Jan's office at Curry about mid-afternoon when Janet finally got a call from Cook Travel offering her a job in Cambridge. She accepted immediately. She went over to tell her friend Judy at the advising office, and Judy actually cried. Janet said that Judy hated change. She told Judy she was going to try to get her a job there as well. I started at BAC on September 7th. I began the day by speaking with the president, George, about the position and what my role in the reorganization of the administrative computing facilities was supposed to be. I used a new micro recorder for the first time. I wanted to make sure that there was no misunderstandings and that I didn't forget anything that was said during these interviews. After our discussion, he gave me the tour of the whole building. What surprised me was that even though the building was about 20 years old, it was rather disorganized and the facilities were rather Spartan for a school. I put the microcomputer to good use. I spoke to all the staff people at BAC over a couple of weeks, about 20 altogether, 20 people. For the first time in a long time, I actually enjoyed the prospect of going to work in the morning. The commute was about an hour and a half. After the interviews, I turned in my first white paper on the progress to date in my assessment of the present situation. My report drew on 2 previous reports done in 1987 and one, the TDC report, done earlier that very year. But I expanded the scope of the task beyond either of the previous reports. I liked the people there, but I did feel a sense of uneasiness among the group. In some ways, the situation was not unlike Curry, organizationally at least. Each person has either carved out a niche or was handed a specific job to do. In either event, it's pretty much up to them as to how best to accomplish their tasks. There was no real training program. I was hopeful that when we finally upgraded and expanded the computing capabilities, there'd be more sense of cohesiveness. I accompanied Paul to Norwood as he picked out and did the paperwork to buy a new Ford Ranger truck. He'd had it a good week and was absolutely thrilled. On October 1st, I wrote up and handed George Terrian my resignation. I felt that I was not being given a level of authority in my position that I was led to believe I would have when I was interviewed for the position. I had gone to George in the morning just to keep him up to date on how my thoughts were evolving as the process continued. Since the BAC was in the process of upgrading to a voice and mail system, I wanted to let him know that if it were possible, this would be the appropriate time to pull new wire to existing outlets that would allow us to pass voice and data over the same lines. I told him I had received an estimate that this expense would amount to between $6,000 and $8,000. At this point, he seemed to get irritated that I was not following the path indicated in the TDC report, which suggested an immediate purchase of desktop computers. I reminded him that I had previously expressed my concern about the wiring infrastructure. I explained that in order for micros to be more than glorified word processors, they needed to be networked. He mentioned that we should be able to implement a plan in stages, starting off by peppering the desks with microcomputers that would be able to share printers. I advised him that even that would require a network, which requires appropriate wiring. At some point, he appeared to lose patience and was apparently upset that I was taking up his time with this new revelation. He started to lecture me about what my job was and began to write down on a paper how I was expected to proceed. After a few minutes, I just got up and walked out while he was talking, told him that I had some things to think about. In an hour or so that followed, I set to writing my resignation. I walked back to his office and placed it on his desk. I looked at him and told him I was sorry that things hadn't worked out. As soon as he saw the subject of the memo, he immediately called me back and apologized profusely for whatever he had done to upset me. I asked him to read the whole memo, which he did. I reminded him that he had told me that I shouldn't feel held to the TDC recommendations and that I had full authority to put a plan together. At the end, he pushed the resignation back into my hands, and we both agreed that we felt relieved and that it was probably a good idea to clear the air. But over the next months, it became obvious that promises made to me in my interview were not to be fulfilled. When I was hired in September, it was with a clear mandate to move the BAC into the world of modern information technology as rapidly as possible. Just 5 months later, the call to action rings hollow. My disappointment was built upon several realizations. I had never been taken into the confidence of the president. From the start, I was not privy to all pertinent work and documentation already done with regard to prior studies of the technological problems. In my white paper, written before I ever knew about the missing MIS report, I asked to be put in touch with any other decision makers in order to ensure the closest possible working relationship with interested parties. Not only was I not informed, verbally or by documentation, of the prior work of the board members, but a recent memo instructed all staff to refer any questions from a board member to the president. I'm a consensus builder, and I welcome the input of any interested parties. I don't like getting caught up in internal politics. The BAC is more than a college. It is a center, and I think the distinction is being lost in that squabbling. I agreed that while the staff should not be managed by the board, it should be responsive to it, especially with regard to services. The mandate to bring about a change that I know I heard during my job interview had not been followed up by appropriate deeds or actions. While it is true that recabling the center had finally occurred, this happened only over the initial protest and numerous explanations that all the other pieces, like the land and any new administrative system, would rely on the creation of this technological foundation. The president had kept his distance from me in the process. I had to work through the director of administrative finance. This had resulted in some degree of confusion and misunderstanding as to the specifics of my proposals and had to pass through a non-technical individual to the president. Though I was hired as the professional to oversee the process, it continued to be unclear exactly what priorities of the board or the finances were. And I was under the impression that the BAC would be taking a loan out and amortizing it as a capital expense over a period of 5 years. Then I was told that a 5-year loan would not be possible. Only a 3-year amortization period was permitted under the regulations governing the BAC finances. Finally, I was told that the BAC was looking very carefully at leasing possibilities. Movement toward purchase and deployment of the land was stalled, and the time for a new administrative mini had been pushed well into the future. I was frustrated with the organizational placement of the position itself. The scope of the position, covering as it did the whole of the organization, and the size of the institution, recommended that the manager of IS, myself, report directly to the president. The burdens of the director of finance and administration are too great to require her to feel the need to understand every technical detail of my recommendations. I expected to assume responsibility, I had over 12 years of experience in the field, and as an academic and professional, I know how to research a problem and make informed decisions. I felt as though I was hired under false pretense and for appearance's sake only. I submitted a 17-page report entitled Administrative Computing at the BAC, but the board never saw the document since it appeared that George and Kathy had preferred to present to the board only the minimum amount of information needed and expand explanation only if required to by the board. Janice was getting psyched about a potential move to Florida at this time. They needed people there, but she hadn't much experience yet, so that could have worked against her. I told her that if she did get the transfer, I'd be out of there. I'd find something to do down in Florida, apply to some temp agency, or even work in a computer store. This is an example of an impulsive decision. I was told by one of my psychiatrists that this was not the time to be making big decisions, and yet that's just what I was on the verge of. At work, there seemed to be some progress. Apparently, the executive committee did decide to recommend to the board the reformation of the MIS task force to work from the basis of my February 1st report, which the treasurer, Neil Harper, apparently liked a lot. Janet told her mother that she had put in for a transfer to Orlando. All Louise said was, "Think hard about the move." Janet expected to hear more on the subject from her, and didn't like the idea either. At the BAC, we had the first meeting of the MIS task group. Kathy chaired the meeting. Each attendee, 2 board members, the president, Kathy, and myself, received copies of both my February 94 report on administrative computing and the 22-page request for proposal that I did, together with some other incidental items. Jan got word on February 28th in 94 that she'd been scheduled to fly to Orlando on April 9th. After debating about when to give my notice, I decided, on the advice of Janet, to do it immediately. I met with Kathy and explained that Janet was being transferred to Orlando and that I would, of course, be following her. I told her that I could work at the BAC until the end of the month, if they wished. Kathy was taken aback and a little disconcerted. I said that I understood the timing was terrible and that I was really sorry. She told me that on a personal level, she had really enjoyed working with me and she thought I was very bright, but she was in a quandary about how to proceed with the computer deployment. However, the work on the network was moving forward nicely, and I felt that I had done much to get them on the right track. Now it was up to them to follow through. From previous entries, it is obvious that had I fit in with the president's idea of what the position was all about, I could have deployed a handful of desktop machines with some networking printers and simply sat back and administered the machines and software. But just like at Curry, I was thinking and acting on a bigger idea, and as a result, I became frustrated. Many other folks are satisfied to find comfortable niche and ride with it for as long as possible. So why couldn't I just accommodate myself to the limited expectations at Curry or the BAC? That is a very difficult question to answer. Had I done that and just did enough, then I would have been in a much better financial situation, much less stressed, but I couldn't. I don't know. On a much sadder note, we found out that the ulcer that Vic had been complaining about for the past year or so was actually some sort of stomach cancer. The only reason it was not diagnosed sooner was that he just started seeing a new doctor. That was a tragedy that probably shortened Vic's life because some doctor failed to order up the right set of tests.